for an amendment, and it be in order for the leaders or their designees to continue to offer amendments in alternating fashion.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, we've seen the last little bit significant number of statements on the floor, op-ed pieces written about process. On this side, we've been talking about the need of 1.4 million Americans needing some help to get them past a real financial crisis they find. It seems interesting to me. The only fix to get no outcome is a Republican strategy. Find something to object to no matter what Democrats try. Process compared to helping in a substantive way people who are in deep trouble. Process never wins, Mr. President. Process doesn't win. We need to move forward. My friend talks about amendments, Democratic amendments. We have 5 too. Ours would have a 60-vote threshold, just like theirs. This is the new target that my Republican colleague, the Republican leader, said we have a new reality around here at 60 votes. This isn't anything I invented. In fact, I wish we'd get rid of that and go back to the way we used to do things. So, Mr. President, I again repeat, I think this has been constructive. I especially appreciate the junior senator from Nevada, senior senator from Maine, and working to come up with something. I'm disappointed that we couldn't work something out, because it appears, what I've been told, is they're going to object to this consent agreement just as I object to modifying my consent agreement.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Is objection heard to the majority?
Mr. President, I just would like to ask the leader a question.
He
is there objection?
You reserve the right to object. You reserve the right to
objection.
Mr. President.
Objection was heard from the Republican leader's request.
Mr. President.
Is there objection to the majority leader's request?
Object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I would be the last to criticize the chair, but my friend from New York was standing to reserve the right to object.
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President.
Senator from New York.
And let me just say this. I think on both sides of the aisle there's a real desire to try and work things out so we can have more debate, more discussion. And it seems to me, Mr. President, from the years I've been here, not as long as either leader, that there's always been sort of a way the place worked, particularly in the old days when it worked better. The majority sets the agenda. That's their right as majority. The minority has the right to offer amendments, both amendments that might change that agenda and amendments, frankly, that might be tough to vote for, so the minority can capture the majority again. And that's been fair. But it seems to me that what our friend, my friend, the Republican leader is saying is we want all the amendments we want, but we're still going to filibuster any bill you bring up. Now, maybe a few have said if our amendments pass on the other side, maybe we won't filibuster, but that's not much of a fair deal. So I would suggest that what the leader has suggested, the Democratic leader, is eminently fair. It gives the Republicans their time-honored right, or the minority, no matter who it is, their time-honored right to offer amendments, difficult amendments. That's part of the deal. But it gives the majority the right to set the agenda and not have the things they bring forward just filibustered ipso facto and not being allowed to come to a vote. And it is, in fact, true, as I understand it, that a couple of those who are offering amendments on the other side of the aisle have stated that if their amendment doesn't pass, they won't allow us to come to a vote. So I would hope that we could proceed along the way the majority leader suggests, but to simply offer amendments, relevant, not relevant, germane, not germane, and then make it almost certain that the bill will be filibustered and we won't be able to get an up or down vote. All we're asking is an up or down vote on employment insurance after all the amendatory
Mr. President, regular order.
Is eminently fair, so I object.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
I believe I objected to the Majority Leader's consent request.
You did, sir.
I ask unanimous consent to call up the Heller Amendment, number 2651.
Is there objection? Objection is heard, sir.
I ask unanimous consent to call up the Coburn Amendment, number 2606.
Is there objection?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Parliamentary inquiry. Is it correct that no senator is permitted to offer an amendment to the unemployment insurance bill while the Majority Leader's motion to commit with instructions with further amendments is pending?
The senator is correct.
Further parliamentary inquiry. If a motion to table the Reid motion to commit with a further amendment is successful, would there still be Reid amendments pending that would prevent anyone from offering an amendment?
The senator is correct.
Mr. President, I have an important amendment that I would like the Senate to debate and vote on. The Reid motion to commit is currently blocking consideration of those amendments. In order for the Senate to start considering amendments, including the Coburn Amendment, 2606, I move to table the pending Reid motion to commit with instructions and ask for the ayes and nays.
Mr. President?
Is there a sufficient second?
Mr. President?
Majority Leader.
I do have a right to object to this, do I not?
Correct. The senator is correct, but the question is on the cloture motion. It takes consent, sir, for the motion to be tabled.
I'm not objecting.
Is there a sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The question is on the motion to table. Yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Good job, Lee. Good job. Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Corning, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin,
I just want to let you know.
Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune.
We got that recorded first.
Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Corker. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Fisher, Flake, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Roberts, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, and Vitter. Senators voting in the negative: Booker, Boxer, Brown, Durbin, Hagan, Heitkamp, Hirono, Manchin, Merkley, Murray, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of New Mexico, and Whitehouse. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? No. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Graham, Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Beckich, no. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, no. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Kirk? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Kane? No. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Donnelly? No. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Nelson? No. Mr. Casey? No. Ms. Landrieu? No. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Baucus? No. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Aye. Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Cardin? No. Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mr. Harkin? No. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Aye.
Does anybody wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 45, the nays are 55. Motion to table is not agreed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader,
I would ask unanimous consent.
can we have order in the Senate, please? Order in the Senate.
Would ask unanimous consent the next two votes be 10 minutes in duration.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on Amendment Number 2631 to S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on Amendment Number 2631 to Senate Bill 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Sure, John?
Ms. Aya. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
I forgot the name of
Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkins. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell.
Oh, I didn't fix the map. Thank
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley.
No.
Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran.
Yeah, stop.
I believe we have something to do. This guy?
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Pryor, aye.
Aye. No, I meant no. Sorry.
Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Landrieu, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no.
Are any members wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. 3/5 of the senator duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is the sense of the Senate that the debate on Senate Bill 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Tester.
Have your stuff. I'll bring some moonshine.
McCaskill. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich.
I didn't know that.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johann. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Donnelly, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Blake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. King. Mr. Pryor. Aye.
Anything else to update on? You got the weight off it.
Wow, I got 37. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Aye. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Beckidge. Aye. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Aye. And Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
We got no Republicans.
Got Helen. Your switch is what.
On this vote, the yeas are 55, the nays are 45.